Many follow me, but few truly understand me. It is not the miracles themselves that challenge human comprehension, but the eyes that observe them. Along my path, many saw signs, but few perceived the truth. I am the answer, but the questions, those, remain to this day. What kind of faith does a man seek when he asks for a miracle? I came to heal more than bodies and calm more than storms. But did they understand? The streets were dense, alive, pulsing with the energy of hundreds of people pushing to get through. The noise was deafening, shouts, laughter, the cries of children, even the sound of feet dragging in the dry dust. I felt the weight of expectations around me, eyes searching for me, many out of curiosity, few out of faith. Peter, ever vigilant, gripped my arm tightly, as if trying to protect me from the crowd. His face was tense, his eyes darting from side to side. "Master, we should move away," he murmured. "This is getting out of control." John, calmer, tried to reassure his friend. "Peter, they just want to see you, hear you. There's no danger." Peter glared at him, irritated. "See what, John? They only want to see miracles, that's all." As if he were a spectacle for their amusement. Peter's words resonated within me. He was right. The crowds came, but their quests were shallow. I could feel the emptiness in their gazes, the longing for something they didn't even understand. A sign. Always a sign. When we reached the house, a small one, with walls cracked by time, the disciples entered first, trying to clear a path. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Bodies squeezed together, the smell of sweat mingling with the dust dancing in the air. My robes dragged the floor, and for a moment, I felt the world shrink around me. "He's here!" someone shouted. Others repeated the cry, voices overlapping, the buzz growing. Then, amidst the commotion, I felt a different force, persistent, humble faith, standing out like a flame in the dark. There on the roof. It was Andrew who noticed first. Everyone looked up as small pieces of clay and straw began to fall. The murmurs ceased, and silence took over the place. It was as if time itself had stopped. Then we saw them. A group of men, faces covered in dust, slowly lowering a paralytic on an improvised stretcher. Their hands trembled with effort, but their eyes shone with determination. They brought him to me because they believed, not just in the miracle, but in the miracle worker. The stretcher lay before me, and the man, lying down, looked up. His face was marked by time, by pain, but his eyes, those eyes had hope. I knelt beside him and spoke softly. "Son, your sins are forgiven." A murmur spread through the room. Pharisees, who had entered secretly among the crowd, exchanged glances, their faces tense. I knew what they were thinking. Their words were unspoken, but echoed in their hearts. Who is this who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone? I stood up and looked in their direction, my voice firm but calm. Why do you reason these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say to the paralytic, "Your sins are forgiven," or "Rise, take up your bed and walk"? They were silent. "But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." I turned to the man, who was now breathing with difficulty, tears streaming from his eyes. "I say to you, rise, take up your bed and go to your house." For a moment, the silence was absolute. The hearts of those present seemed to beat in unison. Then he moved. First, a finger, then an arm. The man slowly rose, as if he were discovering his own body for the first time. A muffled cry echoed at the back of the house, followed by gasps of astonishment. He stood up, firmed his feet on the ground, and with tears on his face, he took the stretcher that had once been his bed of pain. "Glory to God!" someone shouted in the crowd. Others knelt, tears flowing, hands raised. But I also saw skeptical, rigid gazes, silently accusing me. I saw Pharisees hurriedly leaving, their robes dragging the dust, planning. Peter approached me, still stunned by what he had just witnessed. His voice came almost in a whisper. They saw. How can they not understand?" I looked at him, and then at the horizon, where the sky was beginning to darken. "Not everyone wants to see," Peter. Not everyone wants to hear. That night, while the wind blew softly, I sat outside the house. John came closer, sitting beside me. He said nothing at first, just looked at me, as if trying to understand what he had seen. "Master, why did you give them so much?" he finally asked. "Even knowing some will never believe. Because love, John, does not choose whom to reach." He nodded, thoughtful. The silence between us was comfortable, like a rest after a long day. But even there, under the starry sky, I knew the true miracle was yet to come. The morning dawned gently when we left the small house. The wind blew lightly, carrying with it the scent of the olive trees. The disciples walked by my side, but not in silence. They spoke among themselves, their voices blending astonishment with doubt. "I've never seen anything like this," said Andrew, still in awe. The man stood up as if he had never known pain. Peter nodded, but his brow was furrowed. And yet the Pharisees hurried away. "They didn't come to witness the glory of God. They came to watch you, Master." I knew. I knew what they carried in their hearts. They saw, but they didn't perceive. The true miracle wasn't raising a paralytic, but opening a hardened heart. And many there remained blind. The road led us to Jerusalem, where the streets were noisier, the markets full of life. Fragments of conversations were lost in the air, vendors shouting their prices, children running between the adults' feet, voices of prayer rising from the temple. And then I saw him. In the shadow of a tree, a blind man sitting on the ground, his knees covered in dust. He held an old staff, his head bowed, as if the weight of his darkness bent him in half. Around him, the world continued, but no one saw him. He was invisible. The disciples noticed him too, and one of them, Thomas, hesitant but curious, asked, "Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" It was a common question, an echo of the beliefs of that time. Pain, disease, deformity, everything was attributed to sin. I looked at the man, who now seemed aware, as if he sensed our presence. "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," I answered, my voice calm. "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." The disciples fell silent, trying to comprehend my words. The truth was simple yet profound. Not all suffering has guilt. Some suffering exists to reveal something greater. I approached the man. He turned toward me, his empty eyes facing me. There was something different about him. Not despair, but a quiet expectation, as if he knew something was about to happen. I knelt beside him. He did not move, did not ask what I was doing. I took a handful of dry earth, mixing it with my saliva to form mud. The sound of the grains being crushed seemed to echo in the silence around us. Carefully, I touched his eyes with the mud. The gesture was simple, but full of meaning. I saw the disciples glance at each other, confused. Some murmurs began among the people who gathered, watching from a distance. "Go," I finally said, my voice soft but firm. "Wash in the pool of Siloam." The man nodded, his hands trembling as he fumbled along the ground in front of him. Peter made a move to help, but I stopped him with a glance. He needed to go on his own. Faith required the first step. As the man walked, the murmurs grew. Some mocked. "Mud? Saliva? What kind of healing is this?" Others watched in silence, intrigued. John approached me, whispering, "Why the pool, Master? Why not just heal him here?" I looked at him and smiled. Faith must be exercised, John. It's not just receiving, it's obeying. Minutes passed, and the crowd began to disperse, bored by the lack of a spectacle. Then came the cry, cutting through the air. A sharp sound, filled with emotion, echoing down the street like thunder. "I can see! I can see!" The man came running, stumbling on his own legs, his eyes wide, tears streaming down his face. He looked at everything, the blue sky, the trees, the stones in the path, as if he wanted to absorb the whole world at once. "I can see," he repeated, his hands touching his face, as if needing to make sure. "Master." The crowd began to gather again. Some people stood frozen, speechless. Others whispered, pointing at him, "Isn't this the man who was always begging?" "It's me," he replied, exultant. "It's me." A group of Pharisees appeared in the crowd. I saw their faces, tense and suspicious. One of them stepped forward, staring at the man coldly. "How were your eyes opened?" The man paused for a moment, panting. Then, simply, he replied, "A man called Jesus made mud, anointed my eyes, and told me to wash in the pool of Siloam. I went, washed, and now I see." The Pharisee frowned, his voice harsh. "This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath." Others began to argue among themselves. How can a sinner perform such signs? I saw the confusion grow among them, but the man remained firm, as if nothing could shake the joy of seeing. "What do you say about the one who opened your eyes?" He smiled, looking in my direction, though he still didn't know who I truly was. "He is a prophet." The voices grew louder, the argument heated. But for me, none of it mattered. There, in the middle of the turmoil, was a man who had seen the world for the first time. And more than that, he had seen with his heart. The night came quietly. As we moved away from the crowd, Peter asked, "And now, Master, will they believe?" I looked at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "Many will see, Peter, but few will understand." John, always reflective, came closer again. "And him, Master?" "The man. Did he understand?" I smiled softly. "He saw more than the Pharisees will ever see." The sun seemed to shine brighter that day, burning the dry earth beneath our feet. The sky was clear, with no cloud to offer rest to the crowd following us. They came from all corners, villages, fields, distant cities. Men, women, children, and the elderly, all walking in silence or speaking in low murmurs. Peter looked back, counting the number of people following us with his eyes. His face was tense, and he came closer, almost whispering so he wouldn't be heard. "Master, they keep coming. There are thousands." John, walking beside us, added, "Some came just to hear you speak. Others—" He hesitated, looking at a child holding his mother's hand tightly. "They seem hungry." I stopped in the middle of the path, observing the people. I saw faces burned by the sun, feet wounded from the long journey. I saw hope mixed with weariness, like a thread about to break. They were hungry. More than that, empty. I sat on top of a small hill, where I could see them better, and the disciples did the same. Gradually, the crowd settled in the valley. There was a deep silence, as if even the wind had stopped to listen. I stood up and began to speak. My words were simple, yet they cut like a sword. I spoke about the kingdom of God, about a father who saw their pain and did not abandon them. I spoke about a hunger that cannot be satisfied with bread and a thirst that cannot be quenched with water. They listened, some cried, others nodded with eyes full of faith. Time passed. The sun slowly descended on the horizon, painting the sky with golden and reddish hues. Peter came closer again, visibly worried. "Master, send the crowd away so they can go to the villages and buy food. They have nothing to eat, and we're in the desert." I looked at him with tenderness. "Give them something to eat." Peter froze, blinking as if he hadn't heard correctly. "How, Master? With what?" Even 200 denarii wouldn't buy enough bread for each one to have a small piece. Andrew, who had been listening, came forward, bringing a boy who looked no older than 8. The boy held a small basket with both hands, shy but determined. "Here's a boy," said Andrew, hesitantly. "He has 5 loaves and 2 fish. But what is that for so many people?" I knelt down to the boy's height, and he looked at me with those large, sincere eyes. There was something in him, a simple faith, like that of a child who does not doubt. "May I take what you have?" I asked. He smiled and handed me the basket without hesitation. I stood up, holding the small basket before the disciples and the crowd. They looked perplexed. Some whispered among themselves, doubtful. "Tell them to sit down," I instructed the disciples. They obeyed, organizing the people into small groups scattered across the valley. The murmuring diminished, and silence returned. All eyes were on me, filled with questions. I raised the basket to the sky and prayed. Father, I thank you. That prayer broke the stillness of the moment. I broke the bread, handing pieces to each of the disciples. Peter hesitated. Go, Peter, I urged, and distribute. With uncertain steps, he moved away, followed by John, Andrew, and the others. To the first group, Peter handed out the bread and fish, waiting to see what would happen. But the bread didn't run out. He gave more, and more. Soon, the look of doubt on his face turned into surprise. Master, murmured Andrew, coming closer to me with wide eyes. It keeps coming. How is this possible? Distribute, Andrew, I replied, smiling gently. The disciples went and returned, and the miracle multiplied in their hands. Soon, everyone was eating. Children laughed, the elderly cried with emotion, families shared the bread with one another. The smell of roasted fish mixed with the evening breeze. Gradually, the silence gave way to the sound of joyful voices, as if the valley had been taken over by a great celebration. I saw the boy who had given me the basket sitting next to his mother, smiling as he watched the people eat. He looked at me and waved. When everyone had eaten their fill, I spoke to the disciples. Gather the leftover pieces, so that nothing is lost. They obeyed. Minutes later, 12 baskets full of leftovers were before us. From the little that had been given, there was more than enough left. Peter placed one of the baskets on the ground, still out of breath, and looked at me with admiration mixed with astonishment. I've never seen anything like this, he whispered. The crowd began to stir again. I heard voices in the distance. This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world, others said. Let's make him king. The wind blew strongly, like a warning. Peter, noticing my expression, came closer again. Master, they want to proclaim you king. Why don't you let them? Isn't this what the Messiah is supposed to be? I looked at him with tenderness, placing a hand on his shoulder. The kingdom I bring, Peter, is not of this world. I moved away, climbing the hill once more. I looked to the sky, where the sun had already disappeared, leaving behind a purple and golden mantle. My words echoed in my heart. They saw the bread, but they did not see the sign. In that silence, alone, I conversed with the Father. They had been fed, but they remained hungry. Not for food, but for truth. The true hunger was still there. After the multiplication of the loaves, the sky began to darken, tinged with purple and gold. The murmuring of the crowd was still distant, like an echo lost in the valley. The joy and excitement still hung in the air, but something inside me knew they didn't understand. The disciples were weary, their bodies heavy from the long day and from seeing the inexplicable. I approached them, speaking firmly. Go to the boat and head to the other side while I dismiss the crowd. Peter hesitated. Master, come with us. The people might still want. Go, I repeated, my voice leaving no room for debate. They nodded and moved away, boarding the boat that awaited on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. I watched as the boat began to glide smoothly across the calm waters, slowly disappearing into the growing darkness. I dismissed the crowd who still insisted on following me. Some cried out for me to stay, others simply wanted more bread, more signs. When the last of them departed, silence finally returned. I climbed the hill alone, distancing myself from everything, seeking only to be with the Father. Prayer wrapped around me like a cloak. There, away from the shouting, the fatigue, and the expectations, I found rest. The wind blew softly, and the sky, now dark, pulsed with stars that seemed to touch eternity. Father, I murmured. They have eyes, but they do not see. They ask for signs, but they do not seek the true sign. The wind picked up, lifting the dust around me. Down below, the sea, which had once been still, began to stir. I looked toward the horizon and saw darkness take hold of the waters. A storm was forming. My eyes searched for the boat, now distant, just a shadow against the turbulent sea. The wind howled, the waves crashing against the vessel, lifting it like a fragile toy. I saw the disciples struggling, rowing with all their might, their voices drowned by the roar of the wind. The darkness was thick. For them, the storm was everything. Fear took shape among the waves, growing and surrounding the boat like a heavy cloak. They could not see that they were not alone. I descended the hill, drawing closer to the churning waters. The storm did not touch me. Each step was firm, and the sea, which spat violent waves, parted beneath my feet. I began walking toward the boat. Inside the boat, the disciples were exhausted. Peter, gripping the tiller, shouted against the wind, "Row! Don't stop! We're going to sink!" Andrew looked at the waves in terror, water streaming down his face. Thomas murmured, almost like a prayer, "We won't survive this. This is the end." John was kneeling at the bottom of the boat, his hands clutching the wood, his eyes closed. He prayed silently, seeking peace amidst the chaos. It was then that they saw me. A shadow moved over the waters, approaching slowly. The waves seemed not to touch it. Peter saw first, his eyes wide with panic. He shouted, "It's a ghost!" The others froze, fear robbing them of their voices. I saw their eyes, eyes that had seen miracles, eyes that had witnessed signs, now filled with terror. I spoke, my voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "It is I. Do not be afraid." The words sliced through the chaos like a beam of light. Silence fell, even if only for a moment. Peter, still trembling, leaned forward, trying to see better. His voice came hesitantly. "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." I smiled with tenderness, seeing in him the mixture of faith and fear that always accompanied him. "Come." Peter looked back, seeking the eyes of the others, as if searching for courage in them. But no one spoke. Then, slowly, he stood up. His hands still trembled, but there was something in his eyes now, a spark of faith that the wind could not extinguish. He placed one foot outside the boat. The wood creaked under the weight. The second foot followed. When Peter stood on the water, the world seemed to silence. The wind still blew, the waves still roared, but nothing touched him. "I'm walking," he murmured, almost in disbelief. "I'm walking." I took a step toward him, my eyes locked on his. Peter walked slowly, one step at a time, faith sustaining his feet. But then he looked around. The wind blew stronger, a wave rose beside him, and terror returned to his face. "Lord, save me," he cried, as he began to sink. I quickly approached and took his hand, pulling him up. His eyes met mine, still filled with fear. "Man of little faith," I murmured softly, "why did you doubt?" Together, we returned to the boat. As soon as my feet touched the wood, the wind ceased. The sea calmed. The waters, which had once been a wall of chaos, were now smooth, like a mirror reflecting the stars. The disciples were still, their clothes damp, their eyes fixed on me. John was the first to speak, almost in a whisper. "Truly, you are the Son of God." The others nodded, their voices echoing the same truth. Peter, still out of breath, sat on the floor of the boat, water dripping from his hair. He looked at me, embarrassed, but with something new in his heart, a faith stronger than before. As the boat glided smoothly over the sea, silence enveloped us. A silence full of peace, the kind of silence that only comes when fear is overcome. I stood at the bow, looking up at the sky. The stars shone, illuminating the way. The sea, now calm, whispered like an ancient chant. In that silence, I knew they had learned something. The miracle wasn't just the calming of the sea, nor was it Peter walking on the water. The miracle was that they were beginning to believe. The sun was beginning to set when the messenger arrived. His face was covered in dust and sweat, his breath heavy, as if he had run the entire way. He stopped before me, dropping to his knees to catch his breath, and murmured between gasps, "Lord, the one you love, Lazarus, is sick." The news brought silence. All the disciples looked at me, waiting for my reaction. I knew what Lazarus meant to them, and even more to Martha and Mary. They were more than friends, they were family. Andrew, always the sensitive one, approached cautiously. "Master, Should we go now? There's no time to lose. I turned to him, my voice calm but filled with certainty. This illness is not unto death, but for the glory of God to be revealed. The disciples exchanged confused glances. I could hear their thoughts. If it's not unto death, why don't we leave right away? If it's serious, why wait? But I didn't respond. I remained there for 2 more days while their hearts grew more restless. On the 3rd day, I stood and said, "Let's go to Judea." Peter stopped in front of me, a mixture of concern and frustration on his face. "Rabbi, the Jews just tried to stone you, and you're going back there?" I looked at him, my voice filled with meaning. "Are there not 12 hours in the day? He who walks in the day does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But he who walks in the night stumbles, because the light is not in him." They were silent. I took a step forward and then spoke gently. "Lazarus, our friend, is sleeping, but I will awaken him." Thomas, who always struggled with his doubts, murmured, "If he sleeps, Lord, he will get better." I looked into their eyes, sadness and firmness mixed in my voice. "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake, that you may believe, I am glad that I was not there. But let us go to him." We arrived in Bethany 2 days later. The roads were filled with mourners and acquaintances who had come to comfort Martha and Mary. The air was heavy, filled with lamentations and sobs. When they saw us from a distance, Martha ran to meet me. Her eyes were red, the pain visible in every step. "Lord," she said, her voice choking, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died." I stopped and looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. It was a mixture of faith and sorrow, love and pain. "Martha," I responded gently, "your brother will rise again." She nodded sadly, averting her gaze. "I know, Lord. He will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." I approached her and placed my hand on her shoulder, bringing her back to the present. My voice was firm, but full of hope. "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." "Do you believe this?" Martha looked into my eyes, and something shone on her face. The pain was still there, but a spark of faith was reignited. "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world." She stepped back to call Mary, who came weeping. When she saw me, she fell at my feet, her tears wetting the ground. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." I was pierced by her tears. I looked around and saw the mourners, the desolate faces, the sorrow impregnating the air. A sob escaped from Mary, and I felt my own heart tighten. Tears filled my eyes. "Where have you laid him?" I asked softly. "Come and see, Lord," they responded. As we walked toward the tomb, the tears finally rolled down my face. The mourners whispered among themselves, "See how he loved him." But others murmured, skeptical, "Couldn't he, who opened the eyes of the blind, have kept this man from dying?" We stopped before the tomb. A large stone sealed the entrance, cold and imposing. The smell of death lingered in the air, the memory of mourning still fresh. "Take away the stone," I commanded. Martha hesitated, her face pale. "Lord, by now there is a stench. He has been dead 4 days." I turned to her, my voice calm but firm. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" She nodded, and the men began to move the stone. The sound of the stone scraping echoed, like a warning of what was about to happen. A heavy silence fell over everyone. The world seemed to hold its breath. I lifted my eyes to the sky and prayed. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me. But I say this for the sake of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." Then, with a voice that rang like thunder, I called out, "Lazarus, come forth." The crowd was still, eyes wide, fixed on the tomb. First, silence. Then, a muffled sound, footsteps, the rustling of cloth. And then, he appeared. Lazarus, still wrapped in linen strips, his face covered. Shouts of astonishment and spasms of emotion exploded all around. Some fell to their knees, others ran back, unable to bear the impossible unfolding before their eyes. "Unbind him and let him go," I commanded. The men approached, trembling, and began to remove the strips. Lazarus stood there, breathing deeply, life slowly returning to his body. Mary ran to him, holding his face between her hands, tears of joy now replacing the tears of sorrow. Martha embraced him, weeping, unable to say a word. In the distance, I saw some Pharisees watching in silence, their faces stern. They did not celebrate. For them, the sign was not a cause for faith, but a threat. I knew this moment would be a turning point. As the sky began to darken, I moved away from the crowd. Peter followed me, hesitant, with questions in his eyes. "Master, how was this possible?" "He was dead. I saw it." I looked at him, sadness and purpose mixed in my voice. "The Son of Man came to give life, Peter. But the life I give will come at a price." Peter didn't understand. Not yet. That night, the murmurs of the crowd echoed throughout Bethany. "He brought a dead man back to life," they said. But amidst the celebration, the shadow of the cross was already beginning to stretch. Night fell over Bethany, bringing a false peace. Lazarus, Martha, and Mary were together in the house, receiving friends and acquaintances who still couldn't believe what they were seeing. Lazarus, who had just recently lain in a tomb, was now smiling, eating, and conversing. His presence was a living miracle, a testimony that no one could ignore. In the small room, the atmosphere was illuminated only by oil lamps, casting soft shadows on the walls. I sat in a corner, observing the scene. Martha served with joy, Mary sat quietly beside her brother, and Lazarus received hugs and handshakes. The disciples were near me, speaking in low voices. Peter, still intrigued, broke the silence. "Master, after all they've seen today, how can anyone not believe? How can the Pharisees still reject you?" The question hung in the air. All eyes turned toward me. John nodded, his tone softer. "What happened today, Master, cannot be ignored. They saw Lazarus come out of the tomb with their own eyes. That was impossible." I looked at them, my voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Many see, but few perceive. The sign is before them, but their hearts remain closed." Thomas frowned, doubt lingering in his words. "But why? If the sign is so clear, how can they deny it?" I approached the group, my hands clasped, and began to speak softly, as if sharing a secret with them. There is a difference between seeing and believing. They see the miracles as something external, like a spectacle or a threat. They do not perceive what is hidden within them. "Hidden?" asked Andrew, leaning in. "Yes," I replied. "Every sign, every miracle I performed points to something greater. When I multiplied the loaves, it was not just to satisfy physical hunger, but to show that I am the bread of life. When I healed the blind man, I did not just open the eyes of the flesh, but called humanity to see the truth that comes from God. When the sea was calmed, it was not just to silence the waters, but to show that true rest is found in me." They fell silent, absorbing my words. Peter crossed his arms, reflecting. His voice came, laden with internal conflict. "But the miracles, Master, they are so clear. How can they be denied?" "Because the light reveals what is in the heart," I replied. "Some hearts choose darkness. Pride, fear, rejection blind them. Faith is an act of the heart, not of the eyes." John, with tears in his eyes, whispered almost to himself, "And what will happen to them, Master?" "To those who choose the darkness." Before I could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps brought everyone back. Mary appeared before us, holding an alabaster jar. Her eyes were different, as if they carried a weight that no one else understood. She knelt before me, the jar steady in her trembling hands. Without a word, she broke the jar, and the fragrance began to fill the air. The sweet and intense scent of nard spread, enveloping us like an invisible cloud. Silence fell over everyone. With tears gently flowing down her face, Mary anointed my feet with the perfume, drying them with her hair. Her gesture was pure, an act of love and devotion. The disciples grew restless. Judas, always calculating, was the first to speak, his voice harsh and irritated. Why this waste? This perfume could have been sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor. His words cut through the moment, and some of the disciples nodded, murmuring among themselves. Mary, however, remained kneeling, her hands still on my feet, her head bowed in humility. I looked at Judas, my voice firm but without anger. Leave her alone. Why are you troubling her? She has done a good work for me. Silence returned. Judas' eyes shifted away, and he stepped back slowly, the shadows of the lamp dancing on his face. The others still seemed confused, but I continued. The poor you will always have with you, but you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. The disciples exchanged glances, confusion evident on their faces. Peter stammered, trying to understand. Burial, Master? But I raised my hand, silencing him. My eyes met Mary's. She knew. The perfume was not a common gesture. It was a sign. While others still focused on the miracles of the present, she saw what was to come. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what she has done will also be told, in memory of her. Gradually, the murmurs ceased. That perfume, sweet and strong, seemed to linger in the air, as if it were the very presence of the moment. Peter leaned against the wall, still trying to understand, and John, more sensitive, looked at me, discreet tears shining in his eyes. As the silence filled the house, I remained there, sitting, feeling the perfume envelop me like a promise. They did not understand yet, but soon they would. My time was drawing near. That night, after everyone retired, I went out into the garden. The sky was starry, a reflection of the mystery and beauty of what was to come. I closed my eyes and murmured, Father, they do not yet see, but you know. Your will shall be done. The breeze blew gently, as if the Father responded without words. I knew the price I was about to pay, and I knew what would come after. That perfume was the prelude to the tomb, and to the victory that would come beyond it. Jerusalem lay before us, imposing and radiant under the morning sun. From the top of the hill, I could see the city teeming with life, its streets full of people who had no idea what was about to happen. The disciples walked beside me, full of expectation. Peter could not contain his enthusiasm. He looked at the city as if seeing a promise finally fulfilled. Master, look, Jerusalem awaits you. They will receive you as king, he said, with almost naive confidence. I looked at him and smiled gently, but said nothing. He still did not understand the kind of kingdom I was bringing. Go to the village ahead of you, I said to two of the disciples. As soon as you enter, you will find a donkey tied, and with it a colt. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone asks you anything, say that the Lord needs them. They obeyed and left. Peter looked at me with an intrigued expression. A colt, Master? Wouldn't it be more fitting to enter on a horse, like kings do? Before I could respond, John, always attentive, whispered, It is written, Behold, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Peter frowned, thoughtful. The truth was in the scriptures, but he still struggled to understand. Shortly after, the disciples returned with the donkey and the colt. They placed their garments on the animal, and I mounted. The murmuring of the crowd began to grow. The news spread quickly through the city. He is coming. As we entered the path that descended the Mount of Olives toward the city, the crowd began to stir. They appeared from all sides, men, women, children, shouting with voices full of joy and expectation. Some tore palm branches and waved them in the air like victory flags. Others laid their garments on the ground, as a carpet of honor. Hosanna to the Son of David, they cried. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. The disciples smiled, caught up in the euphoria of the moment. Peter marched beside me with his chest puffed out in pride, as if saying, I knew it. I knew this day would come. John, however, observed everything with a deeper gaze. as if searching for something beyond the joy. I looked at the crowd. I saw faces illuminated by hope, hands raised in greeting, eyes shining with the image of a warrior king who would finally come to set them free. But amidst that euphoria, I also saw something else. I saw the superficiality in many of those hearts, the enthusiasm of those seeking a temporary miracle, not eternal redemption. As we approached the city, my joy turned into sorrow. They didn't understand. They didn't understand what I was bringing, nor what was about to happen. I stopped the colt for a moment, my eyes fixed on the city before me. The towers and walls of Jerusalem appeared grand under the blue sky, but behind that grandeur, I saw its ruin. Tears welled up in my eyes and silently flowed down my face. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," I murmured, my voice choked. "If only you had known, this day, what could bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come when your enemies will surround you and destroy you, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation." Peter approached, concerned. "Master, why do you weep? They are receiving you. Don't you see? They believe." I looked at him with tenderness, but also with pain. "They see what they want to see, Peter. They believe in what they hope for, not in what they need." The cries of Hosanna continued to echo, but deep down I knew, the same lips that acclaimed me today would, in a few days, cry out for my crucifixion. The last night came like a whisper. Sitting in the upper room, the disciples were restless but did not know why. The room was illuminated by lamps, casting shadows on the stone walls. The meal was ready, but the atmosphere was heavy, as if a shadow hung over us. I watched them. Peter was tense, his hands pressed against his knees. John, ever watchful, looked at me as if he knew something was about to happen. Judas avoided my gaze, his fingers drumming silently on the table. I rose in silence. All eyes followed me as I removed my cloak, filled a basin with water, and took a towel. I went to Peter and knelt before him. He startled, pulling his feet back. "Lord, you are going to wash my feet," he exclaimed, his voice almost trembling. "What I am doing now, Peter, you do not understand, but you will understand later." He shook his head firmly. "You shall never wash my feet." I looked at him with tenderness and replied, "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Peter's face changed. Pride gave way to love and surrender. "Lord, then not just my feet, but also my hands and head." I carefully washed his feet, the water dripping in the silence. I went to each of the disciples, even Judas, who kept his gaze fixed on the floor. When I finished, I stood up and returned to my place. "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." The silence was deep. The disciples reflected, my words echoing in their hearts. Then, I spoke with a sorrow they still could not understand. "Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." The silence broke into murmurs. Peter looked around, alarmed, while John leaned closer to me, whispering, "Who is it, Lord?" "It is the one to whom I give this morsel of bread after I have dipped it." I took the bread, dipped it in the dish, and gave it to Judas. He lifted his eyes, and at that moment, he knew I knew. "What you do, do quickly," I said calmly. Judas stood up and left, disappearing into the darkness of the night. This was the last night. Soon, I would be betrayed, judged, and condemned. The crowd that shouted Hosanna now shouted, "Crucify him!" They hung me on the cross. As the blood flowed, I looked to the sky, feeling the weight of the world on my shoulders. "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do." And then, I gave up my spirit. But 3 days later, the tears of sorrow were replaced by joy. The stone was rolled away, the tomb was empty. Mary Magdalene, weeping, heard my voice. "Mary." She recognized me, and the world changed forever. Life triumphed over death. The greatest of miracles was completed. The night was heavy. The Garden of Gethsemane was silent. broken only by the soft sound of leaves rustling in the wind and the murmurs of my prayers. The cold earth beneath my knees reminded me of the weight of what was about to happen. Solitude, more than ever, became real. My disciples were there, but distant. Peter, James, and John, whom I had asked to watch with me, were asleep at the foot of the trees, the weariness of the flesh overcoming the spirit's watchfulness. "Father," I murmured, my hands pressing against the ground. "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet, not as I will, but as you will." Sweat streamed down my face, like drops of blood, as agony took hold of me. I knew what was coming. The pain, the betrayal, the abandonment. But more than that, the weight of the sin of the entire world. Every tear, every injustice, every wickedness carried within me. "Is there no other way, Father?" The silence of the heavens was the answer. The silence of the Father was full, but also loving. I slowly rose and went to Peter, who was sleeping against a tree. His head hung to the side, and John and James were the same. I touched his shoulder, my voice soft but filled with an indescribable weight. "Peter, are you sleeping? Could you not watch with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Before I could say anything more, the sound of footsteps echoed in the garden. Torches glowed in the distance, illuminating both familiar and unfamiliar faces. Roman soldiers hurried toward us, led by someone I knew well, Judas. He approached with hesitant steps, his eyes avoiding mine. His hand held the bag of coins, a weight not of silver, but of betrayal. When he came close, he stopped for a moment. Our eyes met, and he knew that I knew. "Master," he whispered. Then, he leaned in and kissed my face. Peter and the others quickly rose, the sound of swords being drawn cutting through the silence. Peter shouted, furious, drawing his blade. "No, Master. Do not take him." Before I could stop him, Peter rushed at one of the high priest's servants, his sword cutting through the air and striking the man's ear. The cry of pain echoed through the garden. "Enough," I shouted. Peter stopped, panting, still holding the sword. I approached the wounded man, who was backing away, holding the side of his face with his blood-stained hand. I touched him gently, and the wound vanished, leaving only clean skin where blood had once been. I looked at Peter, who stared at me, confused and angry. "Put your sword away. For all who live by the sword will die by the sword. Do you think that I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled?" The soldiers approached and bound my hands. I did not resist. Peter took a step forward, but I stopped him with a look. "Let them come. This is their moment." I was taken before the religious leaders, the authorities, and finally, to Pilate. They shouted, accusing me of blasphemy, rebellion, and being a false king. Pilate, sitting in his high chair, looked at me with curiosity. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked, his voice firm but without anger. "You have said so." He continued to watch me, as if trying to understand the man before him. The shouts from the people grew louder. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate stood up, looking at the crowd. "What evil has this man done? I find no fault in him." But the shouts continued, persistent and deafening. "Crucify him!" Pilate looked at me one last time, his expression a mixture of guilt and resignation. Washing his hands in a basin of water, he declared, "I am innocent of this man's blood. You will see to it." I was led to Golgotha, the heavy cross pressing on my shoulders with each step. The streets of Jerusalem, which had echoed with Hosanna just days before, now became a path of condemnation. Each fall drew murmurs from the crowd. I saw familiar faces, some crying, others looking at me with contempt. Mary, my mother, was there. Her gaze met mine, and for a moment, all the pain I felt seemed small compared to hers. John was by her side, supporting her. Arriving at the hill, they stripped me and stretched my body upon the wood. The nails pierced my hands and feet with a dry sound, like hammer strikes against the earth itself. The sky darkened. When they lifted me on the cross, the weight of the world finally came upon me. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do. I saw the soldiers dividing my garments. I saw thieves crucified beside me. One mocked, but the other looked at me, his voice weak. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Truly I say to you, I murmured, today you will be with me in paradise. The sky went black. The veil of the temple tore in two. The ground trembled. I lifted my eyes to heaven and cried out, "It is finished," and I gave up my spirit. 3 days later, the sun rose again, but something was different. Mary Magdalene came to the tomb, her heart still heavy with sorrow. When she saw the stone removed, she ran in distress, shouting, "They have taken the Lord's body." Peter and John came running. John arrived first but stopped at the door, looking inside. Peter entered, breathless. The body was not there. Only the linen strips and the folded cloth. Mary stayed in the garden, weeping. I saw her there, her pain deeper than any words could express. "Woman, why are you weeping?" I asked gently. She turned, her eyes blurred with tears, not recognizing me. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him." "Mary," I called. She stopped. Her body trembled. Her eyes widened, and she fell to her knees. "Rabboni." I smiled at her, with love. "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary ran, carrying the news that would change the world. "I have seen the Lord. He lives." The greatest of signs had been given. Death had been defeated. The promise fulfilled. And the invitation remains. Whoever believes in me, though he may die, shall live.